Welcome to AP Biology. In order to understand photosynthesis, you really need to have some background on light, and so that's what I want to do with you today. So first of all, a photon. What is a photon? It's a particle of light. So light can be understood as both a wave and as a particle, and for photosynthesis, you need to understand both, actually, because a particle, meaning a photon, can bump an electron up to another energy level, but only certain wavelengths of light are involved, depending on which pigment we're going to be using. So let's talk about light a little bit. So first of all, let's look at the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum is any kind of energy that is a magnetic field that produces a magnetic field that produces a moving electric field that produces a moving magnetic field that produces a moving electric field. So you'll study that when you take physics, or maybe you've already taken physics and you've studied that a little bit. They can have really long wavelengths, like this, or much shorter wavelengths. The shorter the wavelengths, the more energy they have. And the longer the wavelengths, the less energy they have. And so the electromagnetic spectrum starts with radio waves to microwaves, infrared light to right here is the visible light, ultraviolet light, X-rays, and gamma rays. So you probably have some sense of some of these already. Like you might know that you put sunscreen on to protect yourself from ultraviolet light, but you don't have to worry about visible light, right? Or actually anything in that direction at all. So it's the ultraviolet light that you might worry about. And you might also know that X-rays aren't good for you to have too many of, right? And gamma rays aren't good for you. They can cause DNA damage. So what we're going to be focusing on in photosynthesis is just this little narrow band of light. And so the wavelengths of light are short here, where it's blue, to longer, 750 nanometers. Any longer than 750, and you get to stuff that we just can't detect with our eyes. It still exists, but we can't detect it. So infrared light, we can't detect that, nor can we detect microwaves or radio waves. But we do have receptors in our eyes that can recognize visible light. And so that's this. So the shorter wavelengths are over here, like this, and then the longer wavelengths are over on this end. And again, the shorter wavelengths are higher energy wavelengths of light, and then the longer wavelengths are lower energies of light. And you might remember the rainbow when you were maybe a little kid in school. You might have had to remember Roy G. Biv. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? And so that starts over here. Red, orange, yellow. And so these colors, you might think that we just named these colors, and what are they really? These colors correspond to actual real wavelengths of light, and it's our receptors in our eyes that can recognize them. We have 3 receptors, and different combinations of those receptors firing will tell our brain what wavelength we're seeing. So there's the Roy G. Biv: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And so when you see something that's red, when you see a red shirt, your red receptors are firing because they have these long wavelengths of light hitting them. And when you see green, your green receptors are firing. And when you see some combination, like when you see yellow, it would, like if you have wavelengths of 60 nanometers sent to, into your eyes, both your green and your red receptors will fire, which your brain will interpret as yellow. And then we also have the blue receptors, which help us to see the blue or in the violet colors. Okay, so light is made out of different wavelengths, and we perceive different wavelengths as different colors. So we have a receptor in our eyes for red, for green, and for blue, and either those wavelengths will stimulate the receptors in our eyes, or like another thing that happens is just different combinations will fire. And so that's how we see. But you don't really need to know how we see color. What you need to know is how it affects plants and other photosynthetic organisms. Okay, so plant pigments. Remember in our last unit we talked about pigments. A pigment is a molecule that can absorb light. So pigments are molecules that can absorb light. And we'll talk mainly about chlorophyll, which makes plants green, but we'll talk about the others a little bit too. So chlorophyll is the main light-absorbing pigment in autotrophs. There are some autotrophs that use different pigments. So there are bacteria that use different ones, and so we'll talk about them a little bit, but mainly we'll be talking about chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. You don't really need to know the difference between them. When in the autumn, when chlorophyll is taken back into the plants, then we can see these other reds and yellows showing up a little bit because they're not really taken back in by the plant. So this chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, you don't really need to memorize that. Here's what chlorophyll looks like. It has a hydrocarbon tail, which is sort of interesting. That lets it sit in a cell membrane, and then it has this other part that sticks out. So chlorophylls and other pigments are embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So thylakoid is part of the chloroplast. So you need to memorize the structure of the chloroplast. These little stacks here are called granum. They're stacks of thylakoids, and each stack here, each one of them is called a thylakoid, and so the membrane there is the thylakoid. And so if you're looking at the thylakoid membrane right here, it's made out of a lipid bilayer, just like every membrane. And here are the pigment molecules. And so here's chlorophyll, one of the pigment molecules that's right in the membrane. So you need to memorize thylakoid membrane is part of the chloroplast. They're arranged in this thing called a photosystem, which is a collection of molecules involved in harnessing light and getting light. So chlorophyll A absorbs best in the red and blue wavelengths, but least in the green. So what's happening there? Well, let's say you have some chlorophyll. It's going to be absorbing light here, right? Here's chlorophyll A, and it's going to be absorbing light here. So when you're looking at a plant, it's because the green stuff has actually been reflected. If you're looking at a red shirt, it's because that red shirt has absorbed everything else here, right? The red shirt has absorbed all of this stuff, but is reflecting this stuff. So the weirdest thing about a red shirt is that it's red because it's not absorbing red, right? And the weirdest thing about green plants is they're green because they absorb everything that's not green. If you're looking at something black, it's because it absorbs all colors. If you're looking at something white, it's because it reflects all colors, absorbs none of them. So this actually is really important. You need to know that. Green plants are green because they absorb everything else. They absorb the red and the blue, but not the green. So photosynthesis captures energy by absorbing light. And for green plants, they're generally absorbing anything that's not green. So if you look at a green plant that has maybe more than one type of pigment, so maybe it has chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B and carotenoids, they are absorbing pretty well everything that's blue, 500 and lower, and they're doing a really good job of absorbing all the reds and oranges. The only thing that they're reflecting really is the green and maybe the yellow-green. So chlorophyll, which reflects green, and that's why plants look green. There are accessory or helper pigments that have different structures and therefore can absorb different wavelengths. So that's why you have some other types of pigments. They can help absorb other light. Chlorophyll B, carotenoids, and xanthophylls are other pigments that are involved. Okay, so this brings me to a question on an FRQ that I saw at one point. And so there's this pigment called bacteriorhabsin, and this pigment is purple. Okay, so why is it purple? Well, it's in purple photosynthetic bacteria, and the reason that this pigment is purple is because it absorbs everything in the green spectrum. So it absorbs green light. It reflects blue. And it reflects red. What is it that red and blue look like by your eyes? So when your eyes have this really quick blue light, it stimulates your blue receptor, and these longer wavelengths stimulate your red receptor. When your blue and your red receptor are stimulated together, you see purple. Isn't that cool? So purple photosynthetic bacteria look purple because they're not absorbing the stuff that you see as purple. So instead, they're absorbing green. So how did green plants evolve? Well, we think that these purple photosynthetic bacteria were here first. And so they absorbed all this middle spectrum. They absorbed the green light. And that means they left the blue behind and they left the red behind. Well, when there's something available in the ecosystem and another organism can use it, that other organism is going to be able to survive and make babies, right? And so we think that the green plants, well, they weren't plants then, they were bacteria, but the ancestors of the green plants used what light was available, which was the blue, right? And the red. So green plants use blue and red because that's what was around. And they left behind the green because someone else was already using it and they came second, right? And so that's why they look green, because they reflect green. Coolio, right? All right, so how does a photon actually work in terms of actually doing photosynthesis? Well, it's all about an electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain has to move electrons through different carriers that have different negativities, right? The ones further on in the chain they have higher electronegativity. They hold those electrons in tighter. So you have to start with energetic electrons. Where do they get their energy? They get them from light. So here's an atom. This is the nucleus right here. And so these are the shells, right? First shell, second shell, third shell, fourth shell, or the energy levels of the nucleus, the energy levels of the electrons. So a photon of light of a certain wavelength can bump an electron up to another energy level. Another wavelength of light might bump the electron up 2 energy levels, or even more energetic light might bump the electron up 3 energy levels. So photons of light excite electrons in a plant's pigments to higher energy levels. So the electrons come from water. Water doesn't have much energy. The electrons don't have much energy, but it's the light that excites the electrons. And you need a light of the right wavelength, because if you have a wavelength that's in between these two, it doesn't do anything. So here's what a photosystem looks like. You have a photon of light that comes in, and the energy is transferred from molecule to molecule until it finally gets to this thing called a reaction center. There's a primary electron acceptor, which can take the electron, and then this is chlorophyll, which is going to give an electron from chlorophyll itself to this primary electron acceptor, who will then send the electron on to the electron transport chain. These are pigment molecules that are called the antenna pigment molecules, because they can harvest light and then send it in toward the chlorophyll, which is this one. So excited electrons carry the absorbed energy. Photosystems are a collection of chlorophyll molecules and other pigments in the thylakoid membrane, and they absorb light. So remember, the thylakoid membrane are these stacks of membranes, and they'll look like this with a bunch of different pigment molecules. Here's the chlorophyll that we're talking about. So there's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Ridiculously, photosystem 2 comes first. I thought you might love that. So photosystem 2 has chlorophyll A. You really don't need to memorize that. Chlorophyll A, the P680 is here, and it absorbs 680 nanometers wavelength of red light best. Photosystem 1 comes second. It's so funny, isn't it? It has chlorophyll B, which can absorb light at a different wavelength best, but the antenna molecules can also absorb energy, or other photons of light as well. So those are antenna pigments. And your reaction center is the chlorophyll, who actually gives the electron to the first electron acceptor in the electron transport chain.